So my name is Peter, and I use he, his, and him pronouns. I'm currently in Toronto, and I'll get the chance to introduce where I'm at shortly. And I live here. I've been here for about 12 years, originally from England and Scotland. And I came to this part of the world to do the work of Indigenous solidarity from a settler Christian perspective. And these days I pastor Toronto United Mennonite Church as part of a pastoral team. And I also volunteer with the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group of Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. And I'll say a bit more about that later, but first I'd like to introduce.
And I'm Rebecca Sealing, and I live in Waterloo, so it's on the Haldimand Tract, and that's where I've grown up too. I grew up in St. Jacobs and then Elora, and now here in Waterloo. I'm a part of Sterling Avenue Mennonite Church, and right now one of my jobs is working with Mennonite Central Committee Ontario in the Indigenous Neighbours Program. Another of my jobs is working with kids in forest and nature school activities and partnering with knowledge keepers to do that work. So I'm happy to be here. It's nice to present again with Peter. We did an in-person workshop at the MCEC gathering, so it was nice to get to know him in person before presenting together online like this.
Great. So we would love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat, and particularly because this is a workshop that looks at land and territory acknowledgements. We would love for you to introduce yourself, the place that you're coming from. If you already have it in your mind, the names of the Indigenous communities there, or something about the geographic region, you can add that as well in the chat. And I'm also going to ask if anybody here came with a land acknowledgement statement, perhaps one from their church or community. Lorna, I saw your hand up first. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to do a land acknowledgement and of the place where you are, perhaps your community. And that will sort of stand on behalf of all of us doing a spoken acknowledgement. Would that be okay with you? All right, lovely. So as the rest of us are putting our own statement into the chat, we'll invite Lorna to share. And I would invite you all to listen for perhaps a word or a phrase or something that catches your attention or raises a question, and we'll have a bit of a chance to check in on that afterwards. Over to you.
Okay. This one was written or put together by our pastor at Bloomingdale Mennonite Church, Zach Clausen. And it goes, we at Bloomingdale Mennonite Church acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Neutral, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Bloomingdale Mennonite Church is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River that was promised to the Six Nations in perpetuity. We have three other little paragraphs here that says, we also recognize that Bloomingdale Mennonite Church has its beginnings in the long and complex history of settler Indigenous relationships and treaties in Canada. The land that BMC that's Bloomingdale Mennonite Church, is situated on was sold to Jacob Schneider in 1805. It was then settled by the Schneider family in 1806. The land has been the subject of ongoing settlement disputes up to this day. One written history of Bloomingdale notes that the Schneiders were the only occupants in the Bloomingdale area from 1806 to 1826, and yet it is also clear that the Schneiders interacted with and traded sour milk and bread for meat with local Indigenous peoples. So it's probably more than you asked for, but that's kind of something that was just recently put together.
So much. What were some of the words or phrases or images that that you noticed as you listened to what Lorna was sharing with us?
I'm going really long now, just look like a white man.
Yeah, any responses to that?
I'll
I
jump in here. Did someone have their hand up though?
Yeah, I see Sharon. Would you like to
Go
share?
ahead.
Yes, I really liked that it actually had specifics about the relationship of the settler family to Indigenous people. Like it was unique to that congregation. And I think that speaks to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So I liked it a lot.
I think for me, I would agree. I like hearing those bits of history, and it helps. It's odd that a land acknowledgement format that is so new comparatively can begun to seem rote, and even some of the names can be quite familiar. So I think some of those details like sour milk, I'm going to remember that. And I really appreciated you sharing that. What did other people hear?
The sour milk stood out for me too, and just the personalized land acknowledgement. And then the words long and complex history. Those ones stood out to me too.
Well, as you continue to put your acknowledgements in the chat, those are super welcome. One of the reasons why we decided to call this workshop together was really because the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group was asked if we would do a land acknowledgement at the MCEC annual meeting. And I said, sure, can we have 20 minutes? And they said, no, you can have 2 minutes and a workshop. So, okay, great. So we need to do a workshop. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to create a land acknowledgement for MCEC as a whole, acknowledging that our congregations and camps meet on different territories, so that we as a regional church have a land acknowledgement. So I contacted, well, not just me, a number of us contacted different pastors and people in churches and said, would you record your church's land acknowledgement? And we got a number of very beautiful responses that I'm very grateful for. And a lot of people replied and said, we don't have a land acknowledgement, or we did one once, or, you know, I have one, but I don't know if my congregation would consider it their land acknowledgement. And I realized there's a lot of different experiences of this in our denomination. So great, let's do a workshop on it. So that's one of the reasons why we're here. And we're just going to begin with a short poll that I think Rebecca is going to introduce. So if your Zoom technology works, you should shortly see a question appear on your screen, and we'd love to get your answer to it.
Can you see it? Not yet? No? I launched it. Maybe you need to try. Oh, there we go. Is it on now? Okay. So does your church use land acknowledgements? Yes or no?
Okay. This is very exciting for me because as a host, I get to see the answers coming in.
It is very, I love it too.
All right, there we go. That's very interesting. So
okay.
I'm pressing share results. Hopefully you can see them. So 65%, so 2/3 yes, 1/3 no. That's interesting. So that is perhaps about right about the sort of responses that we got when we reached out to churches. So I'm going to give us a brief overview of our time together. And then we're going to get into it. So first, we're going to spend some time looking at what we mean when we talk about a land acknowledgement and also a territory acknowledgement, and how we can differentiate those. What are some of the different things that are happening as we're doing this? Oh, you know what? I forgot to do something. I was going to say very briefly about the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group. So there's a few of us here on this call. This is a grassroots organization of volunteers. So we don't represent MCEC, but we work with MCEC to advance particularly the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I should have said that at the beginning. I beg your pardon for that. If you're somehow connected to an MCEC congregation, and if you're looking for some fun volunteering, I would love for you to be in touch, and we will find some good life-giving work to do. One of the things that we have put together or are working on putting together are some resources for churches to use for National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21. So those should be available through MCEC. Shout out to Ron, who's on this call, who did a lot of that preparation. All right, so shall we begin with some of our wonderful.
So just to get us all together on the same page about what is a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement honors original peoples of a place, tries to dig up the history of a place as much as we can, respects Indigenous peoples' inherent kinship with the land, and their connection to the land. That may be something that's a different teaching that we maybe have about the land. Recognizes ways that systemic and institutional systems of power have oppressed Indigenous peoples. It's an expression of hope and a commitment to some kind of action. It's a stepping stone. So one elder that I've heard says that making your own land acknowledgement is a reconciliation. So it's a step on the journey toward reconciliation. And it's a living document, so something that you can return to over and over again as you learn more about the land and about the history of the land and the stories of the land, about the past and about the present. And your land acknowledgement can include two parts. It can be one part land acknowledgement, where you're acknowledging the land, thanking the land for all that it gives us, thanking the water, thinking of the trees and the plants, and the creatures that fly and swim and run, and also thanking the traditional peoples and the ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples to our land, to our stewardship of the land. So that's basically what we'll start with as a definition, and then we'll add a bit more as we go on to another section. Jan Sherman is someone that I've worked with a lot. She's an Anishinaabe knowledge keeper from Guelph. And this is something that she wrote about land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are living entities formed by sacred breath that should be spoken from the heart and reflect humility, gratitude, respect, and responsibility toward place, fire, water, and air. They should speak of our honest, traditionally accurate recognition of our kinship with the land. If you are a guest on traditional lands that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis called home for thousands of years, your acknowledgement should demonstrate respect and gratitude toward these peoples for the way they lived and continue to live in nature. So I loved especially that first part about living entities formed by sacred breath. I think that's a beautiful definition. And this is a little cartoon that shows what we hope land acknowledgements are not. So we hope that it's not just this performative thing that's done just by rote or just as a token kind of thing, and that it's not really from the heart. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Pass it over to you, Peter. Yeah.
Well said. So the question I had for us to have a little bit of discussion about is, how are land acknowledgements used in your worship? Because a number of people, about 2/3 of people here, said that we do have these acknowledgements in our church community. So Lorna, if I can put you on the spot, you already told us a little bit about what you read for us, and you said that was something fairly recent. Has it been used in a worship service?
Yes, so it was used, it's been used once in our worship service, but we've been using land acknowledgements quite frequently over the last few years. And it's basic, and for us, it's been kind of at the discretion of the worship leader So whoever's worship leading that week, because we alternate, like when I do it, when I worship lead, I always include a land acknowledgement. And I do it with the intention of, not besides the acknowledging part, the intention of trying to not challenge, but encourage or spark interest and not forget that we have work to do. That's the intention that I go at it with. And so we always just drawn from, until Zach came up with this one, we were drawing from our own, like we might go to other websites or find land acknowledgements that seemed to speak to what service was or what fit for us, right?
Interesting.
So,
how about other folks? What are your experiences either in worship or other spaces?
I would say sorry.
No, go ahead, Bonnie.
I would say our land acknowledgement, Rouge Valley Mennonite Church has one that we devised some time ago, and it sits in the back of the bulletin, and so it's there all the time, like every week. And I noticed it's kind of shifted around. It used to be at the front of the bulletin and the very, very top, and then it kind of slid to the back and what's going on. But now it's actually on the back of that sheet every week, and it's kind of, you know, got its own frame. And so that's kind of neat. I can't say whether we use it in our worship leading sort of agenda or whatever, but I think sometimes we do. I don't know if it's every time, but.
Thank you. I'm kind of interested in bulletin creep. It'd be kind of fun to track the other items on the bulletin and see what the struggle is there. Other folks.
I was going to say that at Waterloo North, we have a land acknowledgement. During COVID, when we're still in COVID, when we were doing live streamed worship all the time, we had a video recording where Dave Neufeld from our action group stood on the side of the Grand River and read out spoke a fairly lengthy land acknowledgement. And we also have then a written praise paragraph, and that is as Rouge Valley on the back of our bulletin every Sunday. And the use of it during worship or being spoken aloud is up to the worship leader, and it doesn't get spoken very often. When I was leading worship, I didn't use that. I did a different kind of acknowledgement, but I struggle with I want to start with call to worship, not with land acknowledgement. And so how to work land acknowledgement into call to worship or into God's presence, that kind of thing. And so I focused on the gratitude part as kind of being in sync with what I think of as call to worship.
I think that's good. A good thing to wonder about is kind of what place a land acknowledgement can fit within worship, including this question of where it comes. At my church, we have a welcome statement that speaks about the type of church that we're trying to be, and that I think was traditionally printed in the bulletin. I don't think our land acknowledgement has ever gone in the bulletin, and then often the worship leader will share a version of the land acknowledgement sort of as part of that, and sometimes that feels more intentional, and other times less so. But I've sometimes wondered about, well, what if we put the land acknowledgement at the end, or during offering time, or in some other format? And I'll just say as well, you know, in my church congregation, we don't use our acknowledgement in meetings or trying to start other things or potlucks or social events, things like that. It is a time, the Sunday morning worship time. And I'll note an interesting question in the chat here from Esther. How often should land acknowledgements be spoken to be meaningful? I think that's a great question. I feel like some of the very meaningful acknowledgements I've heard have been ones that are not done every week, but are perhaps related to the themes of the of the week or current events, things like that. United Church, that I had some affiliation with many years ago, committed to beginning every service with one of the United Nations Declaration, one of the rights of Indigenous peoples that the United Nations had identified. So there was 162 of those or something like that. So they happily filled a few years with that as their sort of in the place of a land acknowledgement or as part of land acknowledgement.
We
Yes, go ahead.
we acknowledge right at the beginning of our service, and then
Yes.
we've been starting to acknowledge it when we have our meetings for fundraising and so forth.
Mm.
And because we're trying to make all those meetings focused on our mission, that whatever we do, it's based on a mission instead of just fundraising. And we do have an acknowledgement like in the bulletin so that we can read it.
Right.
And
But-
so I'm pleased about that.
Yeah, so it seems like that's then being understood as part of your congregation's intention about why you're doing things.
We've had a Truth and Reconciliation meeting committee for about 12 years.
Mm.
And when we first started it, it was just with our church. And now we expanded before COVID to include some of the other churches. And that made it so much nicer.
Mm.
But we've just been doing it by listening to videos and keeping in touch through COVID. But it's important.
Sounds
There's
like a pretty
beautiful
active
one
church.
At the hospital. I wish I could remember it, but at the hospital on the mountain, the Jervinsky, they
Oh.
put it a very beautiful way of sharing and thanking for being able to use the land.
Mm. That certainly is an aspect of this that I find very conducive to worship, is the attitude of gratitude and the acknowledgement of the good things. It's funny that when Rebecca talks about a land acknowledgement as opposed to a territory acknowledgement, I think about sometimes our worship leader begins with, thanks so much everybody who's here despite the snow or something like that. And even that is a form of land acknowledgement.
Mhm. I was going to say too that I worked with Rockaway Mennonite Collegiate on their land acknowledgement this year and encouraged them to switch up the land acknowledgement part. Depending on the students who were leading chapel that week, they could find something about the land to highlight, and then the territorial part of their land acknowledgement would be the same, or would be revisited less often than the land acknowledgement part of their land and territorial acknowledgement. And when we did this workshop at the MCEC gathering, Peter and I heard from someone who used this as a prayer of confession, or wondered about it being used as a prayer of confession. Anyway, I found that idea interesting too.
Let's see, Josie's hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, for that. I don't think I had ever made that distinction between land and territorial and acknowledgement. It makes sense, and I think I often try to do both, but it's good to think about it in that way, to make that distinction. At Sterling, we've resisted having one land territory acknowledgement that is sort of like our official land acknowledgement. And we do often use it in worship. Certainly more often than not, we have a land acknowledgement, but again, it is up to the worship leader how to do that. And we have a collection of acknowledgements that worship leaders can take a look at, and then they're encouraged to either borrow from that or to create their own. And the whole idea is that we don't want it to become rote. We really want it to come from the heart. So we encourage people as they can, or as they feel comfortable, to give a land acknowledgement that is from the heart, and when possible, making sure that it flows with worship, and that it is part of a prayer of gratitude.
and I was just going to say the one thing that has just happened in the last year or so is that we've started having some of our children, along with their parents, record some land acknowledgements for us to use in our worship. And that has been extremely meaningful to have young people do these acknowledgements. And some of them, like these words, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Attawandaron, they just flow off their tongue in such a beautiful way. They're doing them in their schools, and it reminds me that one of the reasons that we're doing this is for the next generations, and so I love that they're coming alongside us in all of that.
I see Carmen's hand.
Hi. Yeah, Josie, thanks for that. In the fall, we did this experiment with our kids and did something we've never done before, and have worship outside for the kids while the adults met inside. And we also wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. And what seemed instinctual was to offer words of gratitude first, right? And we don't have that in our one that we include in our regular worship, like gratitude. But the kids just started out with, and using our bodies. What are we grateful for with the land, and touching the land and hands towards the sky? And you're right, those words, they knew them all, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. They knew it. It was like amazing and encouraging. But it was, anyway, a new context for me to experiment with the land acknowledgement.
I think that what you're speaking to about recognizing a connection with the land, a presence of land, I think I find that very valuable as well, and particularly about these sort of statements used in worship, and particularly at the beginning of worship. For me, naming us as part of a larger body is very, very close to Christian worship, acknowledging our place within a family of beings, is a very spiritual thing to do. And also acknowledging that there is history behind how we gather, and that we are gathering, and that we're gathering in particular places. I remember joking with somebody who was talking about a time when people were resistant to some kind of land acknowledgement or something like that. I said, oh yeah, we don't need to think about the past. Now let's just read our 2,000-year-old book. Like it's everything that we're doing. We're trying to say, this is who we are. We are God's people. We're called together in this time and this place and this set of relationships. And now let's put our minds together and see what God has for us to do. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we do this, and why we do this in worship as well. And Rebecca, I think you're going to lead us through some of the barriers, some of the difficulties that we can have.
Yeah, so when we've talked with people, there have been certain fears or barriers that have come up in terms of either creating a land acknowledgement or using one at their church. So we're going to actually put you into small groups in breakout rooms to think about that question. I'll just put it in the chat right now. So what barriers do you encounter in creating or using land acknowledgements in worship or in your church in general?
So I'll give you about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and hear from the different groups. Rebecca, did you want to be in a group?
Doesn't matter. I can be, or sure. Yeah.
All right. I'll pop you
We don't
in.
have to debrief anything right now, right? I think things are going well.
Thanks. So far, so good.
Yeah.
I'll pop you into one of them.
Okay.
All right. Oops. I should pause the recording. That's what I should do. All right, I've just restarted the recording as the breakout rooms are closing. Hello. How was the technical side of the breakout room? Welcome back, everybody. All right. We're all back, more or less. What were some of the discussions that you had in your groups? What were some of the blockages or resistances or barriers to the use of land acknowledgements that you've experienced?
I didn't really say this in the group, but some people just don't think a land acknowledgement belongs in worship. It's not an act of worship. I'm not saying that's where I'm at, but I think some of our people do that or believe that.
Yeah. Thank you. Did other people experience that or have that as part of their conversation?
Yeah, it was mentioned in our group as well.
Yep.
As one potential barrier, one barrier.
I think another one that I didn't mention, I was going to just as we came back, was, excuse me, a lack of understanding of where they actually are in terms of, who the First Peoples were, not understanding. And that's something I feel like for me is an ongoing journey to really unwrap some of those things around what did Greater Toronto area look like, who actually was here, that kind of thing. So I feel that that's a barrier because I don't really know. So.
Would you say that's more about I'm just curious if that's sort of more about sort of factual knowledge, or is it more about the complexities of history? So one thing that has come up that I've heard before is, how far back do we go? What exactly are we acknowledging? Is it just the most recent history or our history? I'm kind of curious where your question was coming from.
I mean, I guess I'm looking at it from the point of view of trying to understand how our church got there, how the community, the Anabaptist community that's there, and how, we overlapped with the peoples that were already here. So I guess that's my question. That's my battle around this, is how we can be more, not road at all, but understanding that how does this situate me in this conversation of land, acknowledging who was here. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just to say that those are big questions, and I can understand why they would be experienced as a barrier. When you start to open that box, you find a whole lot of stuff. So I see, Marie, you had your hand, and then George, I see you after that.
I just shared in our group that I think the biggest thing, our working group, we did a working group last year that created, or that worked on this. And the biggest issue we found was everyone was at in our congregation, different knowledge levels, right? And the working group had a specific interest and different various experiences. So we found it important to do some adult education hours to sort of get people on the same page, and sort of did different things throughout the year, just in hopes of trying to learn some of the stuff. And as Bonnie said, there's so much to learn, and it also is changing because we're finding out like things, you know, even the term neutral now, we're understanding that we should use the term, you know, it's more correct to say Chonantonen, not neutral. So it just, and that just in the last year, we're finding this out, and then you have to verify that and figure this out. And yeah, so it is changing all the time, but that's good, right? It's alive. Yeah.
You just taught me something new. Thank you. George, what was your comment?
Yeah, education certainly is a very important part of the whole process. And part of the education is to peel back the layers of denial around colonialism and how deeply we are ingrained in that whole process of still being quite colonial and our attitudes. So I think that could be part of the resistance of having acknowledgement, is the fact that we own the land now, we paid for it, etc. So that in itself is a colonial attitude, and property ownership is a big issue. Especially, I was mentioning within our group out west, we've come across that in an understanding of some of the farmers that have settled there, resisting the whole idea of the possibility of land back. You know, that raises a huge concern. So where do we go with this? And education is part of the process, and it's a big nut to crack.
Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads to that. One point I would make is, you know, with my most charitable hat on, I can say that, you know, churches don't want to include in their worship time something that is not meaningful or is that they're not committed to. So it's clear that there are implications about how we think about land, our own church buildings, our own homes. So I kind of want to commend us for doing that work of considering that and all the education efforts that go into that. I see, Jackie, I see you have your hand up.
No, I just think it is such a challenge because where we are, you know, near Brantford and that, we've had such terrible uprisings, and not to build certain house complexes and so forth. And so you couple that with how can you survive together and respect each other when we've taken over the land, and yet we don't see it as taking over the land. So that's a huge challenge, to go from the one, how dare you look at our land now and take it back, to how can we live together and be peaceful and brothers and share it, but still have ownership. So
certainly having a vision for those matters would be really important.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's funny when we're thinking about a little, you know, 2-minute land acknowledgement or something like that, we can't, it's not a re-legislation of the last 15 years of history, unless I'm worship leading, in which case we might get into that, who knows. What are other folks hearing in their groups?
If I can just jump in, I think one of the barriers for my home church is very Swiss Mennonite farming kind of community, that's not political. You know, it was like the church and the state, and making a land acknowledgement is moving into political state territory. And so that, I think, is still a barrier for some, like how political do we get? And then also what Jackie was just commenting on, and I think George too, about shifting a narrative. Like we have this story of buying the land fair and square, you know, and that's been passed on for hundreds of years now, and that's a hard narrative to shift in people's minds, I think.
I'm seeing some hands at Dalton, and then I see George, you have your hand as well.
When we talk about raising issues that some people would consider political as part of worship, I look around and I think those who are raising questions about it are those who have often mentioned things that skate into a threatened group position. We are people of privilege. And if we want to quiet people down who are raising challenges around sharing, finding new ways of sharing our resources, then the easiest way to do that is to point the finger and say, stop being political. It tends to quiet things down, and we don't have to think about our position of privilege as much.
Thanks for that. George, you had your hand up as well, I believe.
Yes, I spoke at our church in October last fall, and it was primarily a confession of ancestry search. And I went back in my maternal side to my or to the Revolutionary War, and I found that the Haudenosaunee stateside had assisted my my grandparents at that time on both sides. One was in prison for 18 months and losing his health. The other woman with 6 children, his wife, had been swept off the land in Pennsylvania. So I was able to be in touch with the grace that was bestowed upon my ancestors back then. So that to me was a tremendous teaching moment within our church circle in terms of the grace that we need to honor from the people who helped us settle and helped us from harm's reach during those very desperate times. My family spent time in Fort Niagara area as refugees for well over a year, asking for provisions from the military there, and then ultimately was granted a land grant that was substantial. My goodness, what a contradiction all that is. But grace seemed to be the biggest thing that was a revelation to me. And I spoke of the Good Samaritan from Luke in that presentation.
Thanks for that, and for bringing some of your own personal ancestral story into this question. I think that's a very powerful thing to be able to do. And even for myself, who's only been on this land a dozen years or so, being able to speak to my own story, including a story of grace, I think is a gift to give to my congregation. I think that's one of the ways that we can get around some of the distancing behaviors and some of the ways that people respond and say, well, this isn't really our story, this isn't a sacred moment, is we can help to show those patterns of grace, including naming the things that are not so good and the things that we don't know and the things that have gone wrong. Why else gather but to amend something that is not quite right? Seen some interesting stuff in the chat. What other responses were there in your groups? Are there other issues that have come up that haven't been mentioned?
Another practical kind of thing was people don't know how to say the names or the words that are from a different language, and so feel reticent to mess them up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I will 100% put my hand up for this one. I'm very happy in this area of the world. But when we start to have land acknowledgements from a little bit further away, I start to realize I can't even begin to pronounce some of these names. I've been thinking about this recently, and if you'll forgive a little personal tangent here, I've been thinking about what it is when a person takes out a step and says a name badly, but says it anyway. Because I think the alternative sometimes is to say, this is too hard for me to do, and I'm not going to do it. And if that's your personal name, then you would feel so unseen by that person that they weren't even trying to get your name right. So I'm thinking about, times when I've done this and I've said, I probably got that completely wrong. I was like, actually, the most important thing is that we make the attempt and that we try to acknowledge it. And that's about prioritizing the recognition of the other against my own level of comfort, I think. And I can tell you in my own unscientific study within my congregation that some very bad pronunciations a couple of years ago, like very shaky. Now I feel like it's beautiful every time, whoever's doing the land acknowledgement. So something's happening on a cognitive level. This stuff is sinking in. So hopefully those feelings of embarrassment and shame are not influencing how we're choosing to shape our worship spaces.
I've heard that fear a number of times though, and I found University of Western Ontario has a really great page for their land acknowledgements, and I'll put a link there. They have little audio clips on it. You have to scroll down a bit, but they have someone speaking Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Chono. Well, they have Chonotan in their acknowledgement, but they still say Attawandaran. So I think they'll be updating it as they get a speaker to say it.
Another kind of barrier, one church that they're working on, or it's starting to work on a congregation, on an acknowledgement, and just the struggle of what's the first step. Just sort of getting started feels like I don't know if a barrier, but just a huge leap that's hard to make. So getting started.
Well, in a little bit, we'll be talking about some of those how-tos. Perhaps we should move on from this moment. I was going to share a few things. Is there any more burning issues, other barriers or things folks would like to raise before we move on? All right. So I wanted to share a bit about why I find land acknowledgements important and why some of my responses to some of the barriers that people experience. One of them is simply that they are the truth part of truth and reconciliation, or they're part of speaking the truth. And we've already shared a little bit about, sometimes, especially in worship spaces, we say the same things many, many times. Like we ascribe to God the same characteristics. We say sometimes the same prayers. We use the same types of language many times. And we don't consider that to be strange, because there is something holy about speaking the truth, even if it's something that everybody in the room knows or thinks that they know. So as an act of worship, all we're doing is grounding ourselves in part of the truth. And we're acknowledging something that would otherwise go unacknowledged. And I think of it sometimes as being a bit like a baseline of non-negotiables. And in our church community, this is perhaps particularly in my church community, that begins with a acknowledgement of the diversity that's present within us. And it doesn't go so far to say, we have no space here for racism or sexism or homophobia, but it does say we welcome people of diverse genders and backgrounds and gifts and things of that nature. And I think a land acknowledgement in the same way functions to say, this is who we're trying to be. And this is kind of like, this is what we've decided as a community. Now, of course, not all communities have made this decision, so that's part of the journey. But there is something valuable in saying that, and it certainly communicates something to your visitors, to the people who look at your website, things like that. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's very simple. It may not be easy, but it's a very simple way to communicate some of our values. And the other thing I find really interesting is if land acknowledgements sometimes are said, people say they're no good, they don't do anything, it's not the same as action, it'd be better to do something. And I mean, I haven't heard that too much from this group, perhaps because we already think that there's some value to them. Otherwise, why would you be spending your evening here? But you may have noticed a news story from a few months ago where the government of New Brunswick banned its officials from using land acknowledgements. And it's a really, really fascinating piece of history. But I always think if they're no good, then if they don't do anything, then why ban them? So obviously there's something powerful about these statements. And I think some of the resistances that we're hearing about and some of the feelings that emerge for people as they question these things, they tell us that there's something there. There's something unsettled that needs attending to. And I think that that's a very sacred thing to do as a community, is to really look at these questions, especially where identity and heritage are concerned. And the last thing I'd like to suggest is that a land acknowledgement functions as a symbol, in that it both points towards something and it accomplishes that thing. So a land acknowledgement obviously gives you some facts. It tells you something about who we are and where we are and who we're trying to be. But it also works within the congregation over time to instill those values at a deeper level. And it's something that we can point to and say, well, because we have said this thing, that means we need to be this type of people. So those are some of the responses that we've been collecting. I want to share with you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the how, so just some guidance that I've collected from different articles and people. So we've talked about a number of these already, but to start with, making it personal. So thinking of your own connection to the land, whether that's maybe a special place that you go to in the summer, maybe it's where you live, maybe it's around your church, but making that connection to land, I think, is really important as part of the process. And then researching, finding out the history of the land, the original peoples, the languages, and learn the names. Tell the truth. So dive into that discomfort of what it means to live in this colonial place where these the impact of colonialism we still see today and people still experience, and we're part of that as the church. And with the truth telling, I work a lot with children, and so with number 3 and number 6, those are ones that I change up depending on the audience that I'm working with. If it's young children, we focus more on the land and our connection to the land and who are the original peoples. And then with other groups, we would commit to some kind of action and dive into the truth telling part. Use present and future tenses. So sometimes we hear words like this land that once belonged to and then naming of the peoples. So just watch for words that are just putting everything into the past, and words like belonging to implies a certain idea of land ownership that is not generally an Indigenous concept of land. It's more of a settler colonial concept of land. Express hope. So what could tomorrow look like? Some of you have expressed hope this evening around sharing the land and working together going forward. What could that look like? And then adding some teeth to your land acknowledgement and committing to some kind of action together, even if at the beginning it could be something like we commit to learning more about the history of our land and the impact we have as a church on the land and original peoples. So what steps could you take? And then I added a couple more here based on our MCEC workshop that we did a couple weeks ago that people added. So one thing was revise. So schedule in times when you will come back to, especially your territorial acknowledgement, and add pieces to that based on your learnings. So committing to do that on an ongoing basis. And then number 8 is expect pushback. So some of those fears and barriers that we're talking about, that not everyone will be on board with this process at first. So what can you do if you're a smaller group within your congregation, especially to explain some of the whys that that Peter just led us through? Or how can you be clear about your why as a church? Why is this important as part of a process of truth telling and steps toward reconciliation? Is there anything else on the house? We're going to be sending these out a bit later, but there are some great links that we'll send you. One is a map that's called Whose Land, where you can find your the original people groups from your land, and then treaty native land is where you can find your treaty name, lots of information, and then another link about treaties and other videos and learning resources. And this was a treaty knowledge keeper that we worked with in the fall. Some of you were at that webinar that MCC Ontario put on, Morris Switzer. And he says, the most important thing about land acknowledgements is that they are heartfelt. And we've talked about ways of making those heartfelt this evening. I just want, because I have a heart and a love for children, I just want to highlight this book. It's called Giving Thanks. So for any of you who are on land of Haudenosaunee people, it's called Giving Thanks, a Native American Good Morning Message. So it has an artist and writer who are both Haudenosaunee. And it's basically a shortened version of the Thanksgiving address. So I think it's a beautiful, it would be a beautiful call to worship, or a beautiful way of including it in a children's time, or any time. I think it's always great to use children's resources for adults too. And this is a book that I would recommend too. Maybe you want to put this in the chat, Peter, or I can too later. It's called We All Go Back to the Land, The Who, Why, and How of Land Acknowledgements. And it's by Suzanne Keeptu. And for me, I love the chapter about the arts and using arts in our land acknowledgements. So I like to think of ways that you can switch them up a bit and make them creative. And I'm going to take one off my wall to show you. So this is a piece of artwork it's called Revival. And it was created by two artists in Kitchener. One is Oneida and the other is Anishinaabe. So Luke Swinson is the Anishinaabe one and Alana Jewell is Oneida. And they collaborated on this piece. This is Luke's artwork and this is Alana's. And it's called Revival, and it depicts the Grand River here and the water keepers. So I think even using artwork in your worship as a land acknowledgement can be very powerful too. Someone mentioned in our small group about consulting with Indigenous people in the area when you're creating a land acknowledgement. I think if you have a relationship already, that's a great thing to do. And if you don't, then I would start building the relationship before you make an ask like that. Just so that you know the people that you're asking for their time, and that you're offering a tobacco tie and keeping with protocols that would acknowledge the time that they would put into working with you on that. I think that's all, unless other people have some hows that they'd like to add.
I'd love to hear you say a bit more about committing to action. In one thing I think about is my church has a very strong desire not to boast in anything. And anything I think about that I would say as an action that we are taking, I wonder if people would hear that as us boasting about the good works that we're doing or something like that. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Are you asking me or everybody?
Oh, asking you for sure.
Okay.
Right on the spot.
No problem. Well, I think starting this sentence with something like "we commit to," I don't feel like that sounds like bragging. I feel like that sounds like this could be hard work, but we're going to take these steps together as a congregation, Figuring out what those steps might be is maybe the harder part, but
right.
Yeah. We commit. Yeah, go ahead, Lorna.
Oh, and I just want to add to what Rebecca's saying is I appreciate hearing what other churches are doing. So please share, Peter, because we need ideas so we can get some thoughts going on what we can do at our church, right? And what resonates with us. So examples are always welcome.
One thing I did do when I worked with Rockway on their land acknowledgement, I pared back their commitment that they first had, because I was like, are you sure? You're like, because their commitment was around, we commit to being treaty people, and we acknowledge the Between the Lakes Treaty and the Haldeman Tract Treaty and all the promises made therein, or something like that. And I was like, okay, do all of your students and staff know what those are, or should we pare this back a bit and then make it something like, we commit to learning and taking steps together as a community? Like that sounds a bit vague, but is that where your commitment is right now? And then could you build on that after you've learned more about the history of the land and the stories of the land? So I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, because I'm saying, yes, commit to action, but then I'm like, make it practical and make it doable.
I guess that speaks to that additional point of revising, revisiting, which I think is a great, when that was suggested, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, that you've put something together and then you decide, when are we going to revisit this? Because that tells us we want to learn more. We're assuming that we're going to learn more in this process.
Yeah. Do others have examples about commitments that you've added to the land acknowledgement?
I was just going to respond to the last comment about if you try to get the perfect one before you, then it just keeps you from working at it. That's another aspect of the being open to changing it and letting it grow and be alive.
Yeah. I love it that it's like, that you don't have to be perfect, that it's this living document that you keep revising as you learn more.
Someone told me once that before you make a good podcast, you have to make 3 or 4 bad podcasts. Yeah, so just make your bad ones as soon as you can. Exactly. Get through it. And then you can, yeah.
Ron?
I'm still in that phase.
We have a general comment that says, we commit to work for justice and reconciliation. And so we think that kind of encompasses whatever we're going to do, but it also is something that we can report back on, and what have we done to work towards.
And that's a great idea too, to not only look back at your land acknowledgement and how you can revise it, but look at your commitment and how have you done with that commitment, and how can you revise it potentially too. George, go ahead.
My understanding is this segment is about action following acknowledgement. There was out of MC Canada, Steve Heinrich's work, Be It Resolved. And I joined in with that. And part of my activity was to support a committee at Six Nations territory to help develop an immersion school, language school that they're working on there. And so it's primarily avocation. And I've managed to write a couple of letters. And this next week, believe it or not, Mark Miller from the federal government, Minister Miller, is going to be there present at Six Nations. And I've been asked as part of the committee there of elders to say something. So part of the action that I had been inspired to be involved in came with a whole lot of prayer from our church community, Weidmans. And in fact, along the way, there was a substantial donation from the Mennonite community of $5,000 towards the operational costs of the ongoing language school there. So they're wanting to build this multi-million-dollar complex, and it's no small ask. And that's why I'm meeting with the committee next week, and I've been asked to present a small little tidbit to Mr. Miller about the advocacy that Mennonite churches have joined in with me to assist in this project. So that's something that of an action that is already starting, and I'm pleased that Steve has spearheaded this, and I'm just so grateful to be part of that whole process. Of course, with it, I've come with a lot of energy and I suppose baggage from my family background, and gratitude that I understand the need. And I hear also, just as a side point, of people struggling with the names of nations and Indigenous peoples. Well, believe it or not, Indigenous peoples are struggling themselves, trying to learn the language that they have been, for 150 years denied of being able to speak. So this is the challenge of this particular community at the Six Nations territory, is for them to help reclaim their own language. So we shouldn't be too frustrated with not being able to get our tongue around some of the language, because they can't either.
But that's a great point, George, about putting money as an action too, making a commitment through money.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Anyone
So
else?
Jackie had her hand up.
Okay.
Just related to this, I guess, is what I love is to try and use art and music, because it expresses the soul and the values. And I was so impressed with, I guess you've heard of like Jeremy, Ducher, who is an amazing man who's revised all these old songs from the elders and put it to use now, and has the most beautiful voice. Have you heard of him? Because he's been around my area a lot, and he has a record too. But he is amazing, just amazing, because he really takes you back, and he actually sings with the elders. He uses this, it's like wax, and records. They're recorded, and he brings that back. And we were fortunate to have it at the Royal Botanical Gardens, had it, and then I think Mac had it, and he won a major award for music last year, was it? Or
Is it
He's on
Jeremy?
CBC radio a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah, very good.
And to see him perform is so amazing, because he actually sings into the piano.
Yeah.
With COVID, you don't see that anymore.
Rebecca, did you say that this information and these names will be available to us?
We can make it available. Jeremy Dutcher is his name.
Dutcher, yeah.
Yeah.
And he is amazing, isn't he?
Put a link.
But he
in.
makes you excited about the culture and the values, and the art too is amazing.
Thanks for highlighting him.
Every time I come to these type of things, I come away with a whole list of things to look up afterwards. It's great.
On Thursday nights I don't know if they have them during the day, but on Thursday nights at 11 o'clock, there is an hour of Indigenous music on CBC Radio.
So Thursday?
Thursdays at 11 o'clock. And it's from all over the world. It's not just it's from all over the world.
Thanks.
And is that CBC or?
CBC.
Thank you.
89.1 on our dial in Kitchener.
Thank you.
Well, I'm wondering, we have about 15 minutes left of the time that you all have promised. So we had a thought that we might put you folks back into groups to talk over some of what you'd heard, and then we'll come back together to have any sort of final burning comments or what are the next steps we should take, things of that nature. Rekha, anything to say before then?
No, that sounds good.
All right. We are, I believe, all back. Welcome, everyone. So let's just spend a few minutes hearing back. What are some of the burning issues that you're sitting with? What is a question you haven't had answered, but you were hoping to, or what is something that you think you've taken away from this space?
I can share some things that came up in our group, unless someone else wants to go. The importance of reminding ourselves that we, as Anabaptist Christians, it's important for us to base these in our relationship to God and to the land, and also that we are part of treaties. So these can be a reminder of the treaties that we might not really know much about, or a way for us to get to know how we are part of these treaties. That's part of the TRC calls to action for churches to dive into the doctrine of discovery and other things that we can repudiate as the church, and positive things we can put forward. Yep. Reminding ourselves that the earth is the Lord's. Using different means to kind of tweak our emotions. So not just having these rote acknowledgements, but using the arts or things like that that would help us to remember. Thanks, Josie. One person in our group asked for those booklets that are the UN, the UNDRIP booklets. So she's putting a link in there. Is that what you're putting in?
Yeah, and the calls, 94 calls to action, the two different things.
Thank you.
If anybody's
Question that
interested.
came up in our group. I will do my best to capture all the resources that have been named and make sure they get out to folks. And I'll also talk with folks at MCEC about having access to this recording, because some folks mentioned they were hoping to share that beyond the circle.
I have a meeting in a few minutes, so I have to leave, but thank you all for bringing this together and for the discussion. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Dalton.
Thanks, Dalton. Yeah, well, perhaps I'll say a few closing words. I hope this was helpful. I think when we went into it, we're aware that we are continuing a conversation that has begun in many spaces, and we're not assuming that we're going to finish that conversation either. Perhaps if we were all together in a room, we would go into a corner and start to work on our land acknowledgements and brainstorm them and workshop them. And perhaps that's something we could do in future if there's interest in doing that. Rebecca, you had mentioned an idea about doing something like that.
Yeah, at MCC, we're working on 2 workshops. So the first one would be similar to what we just did right now. And the second one would be, okay, let's dive in and work on some land acknowledgements in small groups. So that's what we're hoping to offer in the fall. And I'm sure we could do it through MCEC too. There's probably a way. And I also wanted to put out there that if there are congregations that would appreciate someone to help them walk through this process, I am more than happy to do that. And I can also come and do a sermon or something on Naboth's vineyard, that story in 1 Kings. is a powerful one, I think, for wrestling with some of this stuff. And then also around treaty and covenant.
Mhm.
Rebecca is great to work with. Would recommend. Well, I'll just perhaps offer some words of gratitude then. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for your work putting this presentation together and for sharing with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I said in my group, we did very little advertising of this event, and I think this is a very good turnout. So thank you for all the work that you're doing in your congregations and your camps and your families and everything else to raise our collective consciousness of these issues and help to bring us in a good way closer to the goal of reconciliation that we have. As I think I said, I'll try to send out these resources to you afterwards, and I'll talk to MCEC about accessing the recording and if there's anything we need to do that. But if there are any final words, now is the time for you to interrupt me.
Can you send us how to get in touch with Rebecca?
I think I can, if Rebecca's okay with that, which I'm guessing she is. We'll make sure we do that. Well, go in peace. Have a great evening, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us.
That was great.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.